Right then. Hello, my name is Mikhail Fiadotau, and today I'm going to give you a short talk. I don't want to call it a lecture, it's more of an informal talk about game piracy, and PC game piracy in particular, in the East Slavic nations of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And this is mainly because I happen to come from Belarus, and this is just sort of a trip down the memory lane, a nostalgic thing that I'm talking about. But yeah, before I talk about the actual thing, let me briefly introduce myself. So as Kemi mentioned, I'm based at Tallinn University. I work as a lecturer in the Digital Learning Games program, where we mostly focus on developing educational and serious games. So games that are made for training purposes, basically anything other than pure entertainment. I am also a doctoral candidate in cultural anthropology, where I study games as sort of cultural practices and cultural heritage. And I'm interested in looking at the diversity of various practices of video game production in different countries around the globe, in particular Japan, because I also happen to have worked in the past as a Japanese interpreter and lecturer in Japanese. You can see a picture of myself in a Shinto priest outfit with a smartphone, potentially taking a picture of someone else, as Shinto priests do. I also used to work as a technical writer, so did lots of things with my life before arriving in Estonia. I also sometimes make games. This includes educational games and serious games, as I mentioned, starting from the first game that I ever made that was published on the App Store was an educational game for, it wasn't me, I was part of a bigger team, obviously, a game for children to learn, very young children, animal names and things like that. We've done games for promoting various events. I also make indie games, browser games that I've published with the likes of Armor Games and Crazy Games. So I do a lot of game-related stuff. Long story short, the thing that I'm going to be talking about today is less practical in a sense. It's also not really a part of any past or ongoing research project. It's more of a nostalgic thing that I'm reflecting about and that I just find really curious. Camille mentioned in the beginning, in the introduction, that this talk today, it actually started as a presentation at an academic conference dedicated to games in Kyoto, Japan, where people from various universities around the world and some museums came together to talk about video games and how they're relevant and how they have evolved and what cultural practices they relate to. And I thought it would be cool to go to the city where Nintendo was headquartered and talk about piracy, because that's not really something people seem to discuss a whole lot there. So I'm going to share essentially the same slides with you, and hopefully this is a little bit interesting. Right, so there's nothing particularly new about talking about game history as such, right? Particularly in the recent years, we've seen a lot of interest toward the history of games. There's various reasons why that is the case. Nostalgia is a major part of it. Those of us that grew up playing video games are quite likely to enjoy reflecting on, how video games used to be and how we used to enjoy them and how some games were pure fun as opposed to the photorealism and AAA stuff and loot boxes and all that stuff that didn't used to exist. So the grass was greener, as were the screens of some handheld game consoles, Game Boy being a notable example. It's also a fact that a lot of very good games were produced in the decades preceding this one, and a lot of them are quite fun to revisit and play just because they are good, they are meaningful, and they're really enjoyable. But it's also that understanding game history is also important for a better comprehension of the landscape of video games today, right? If you know something about the video game crash in North America, if you know something about the console wars in Japan, between Sega and Nintendo and Sony, if you know about the origins of particular video games and genres, it's much easier to process what's going on in the market today. And it's also quite an interesting lens into this. However, are people saying something in the chat? If you are, sorry, I can't actually see it, but feel free to interrupt me at any point and just say things that come to mind. We'll have hopefully a little bit of discussion in the end, but you don't have to wait, right? Because again, because I'm sharing my full screen, I'm not actually able to see anything that's going on. So if you want to communicate, please use your voice. But yeah, I guess I'll move on. So there's a lot of different things going on many different levels. There's books about video games, there's research and people at universities like myself who study video games and give talks and whatnot. There's online communities of fan-created fan-created archives, all sorts of things that people do to put together and remember how games used to be. There's memory institutions such as museums and official archives. And there's videos on YouTube, TV shows, all sorts of things dedicated to game history in many different languages, in many different landscapes. I'm just showing you a small selection. There's big video games museums in the United Kingdom, in the US, the Strong Museum of Play. There's the Computerspiele Museum in Berlin, and obviously our very own LVLup Museum in Tallinn. So lots of people studying games from different perspectives. And trying to keep track of the history of games and how they used to be. However, if you look at the bigger picture, it becomes evident that from a lot of these accounts, there's something missing, right? There are a lot of histories in various forms of official gaming, which means that people focus on places like North America, Japan, to some extent Western Europe. There's a lot of focus on particular types of games and franchises, like everybody knows about Mario or Sonic. So the classics are very visible in the picture, but that also tends to leave out a lot of other things. So there's not a whole lot being done about independent, smaller scale, and hobbyist game production. One thing that I'm fairly passionate about, fairly passionate is a weird word to use, very passionate about, let's say, is Flash games. You might remember those old browser-based things that used to be very prevalent in our online lives, back at the turn of the century. Not so visible or remembered anymore. The Flash plugin is being discontinued in browsers. The whole heritage is being lost at some point, and nobody really has done all that much to try and address the situation or actually study the history of it. So a lot of things are not really that much in the focus. There's a lot of geographical contexts that are not being looked into too much again. So if we look beyond the major nations such as the US and Japan, what do we know about game preservation and the legacy and the history of games in Brazil, China, or Estonia for that matter? The answer is not a lot. LVLup has done a great job of highlighting the unique legacy within the Baltics and the broader Eastern European region. But other than that, there's very few initiatives that look at that sort of stuff. And we also don't really get to hear a lot about the unofficial, unlicensed distribution and production practices, which are also a major part of history if you think about what was actually being done. So to me, that signifies an opportunity for reflection and an opportunity for research about studying, about things like piracy in Eastern Europe, which combines the focus on unofficial distribution and production and a sort of more peripheral market, because Eastern Europe was not a hub of video games by any stretch of the imagination. So double trouble, that's something to look into, and that's something that I'm going to try and speak a little bit about today, right? Before I do, however, I also wanted to discuss the very concept of piracy. It seems a self-evident thing, right? When we talk about piracy, not the Somali type of piracy on ships and vessels in the sea, but media piracy. Everybody has an intuitive understanding of what that term means. But an intuitive understanding obviously isn't enough for serious academic researchers, so they've tried to give all kinds of definition to this phenomenon, and I'm listing excerpts from some of these definitions here on the screen. So Lobato in her study describes piracy as an informal and non-legal distribution system which represents a rupture in the orderly regimes of intellectual property. Sounds very fancy. Yes, there's, I think someone either wants to say something or might want to mute their mic. I guess it was the latter. Because, yeah, okay. Other definitions of piracy: informal media circulation, or piracy as an informal institution, which conflicts with formal rules of copyright. So the word informal comes up quite a lot in these academic definitions, which is interesting because they don't really explain what informal means. And if you think about it, a lot of game piracy, any kind of video piracy or media piracy is in fact informal. If you think about where-is groups, right? The online communities of hackers that used to, I mean, they still exist, perhaps not as prevalent today though. They would break the protection systems around games, they would distribute them for free online, and for them it was a matter of sort of intellectual curiosity. Can we bypass this particular form of, say, DRM? Or can we work around this limitation by releasing some sort of no CD patch, which would allow people to just copy stuff from CDs and pass the physical media on to their friends? So that sounds to me like a fairly informal thing because it wasn't an officially registered organization. The members would know each other by nicknames. They would not probably want to be located physically, and that very much falls under, a lot of these definitions. But does that apply to all piracy is the question that I'm posing here. And I guess you can tell that the reason I'm posing the question is that I don't think that's the case. Before I move on, should I have a look at what people have been saying in the chat? Hello, okay. Right, there we are. Alrighty, so let's talk about the particular context in question, right? Let's talk about East Slavic nations in the and early 2000s, which is a familiar context to me because, as I mentioned, that's the time I grew up playing games. We have an interesting cultural situation going on there, right? The USSR has collapsed, which means that the Iron Curtain is no longer there. Western media are no longer banned. You can openly consume them. So you have all this access to all kinds of digital entertainment. There's game consoles, so clones of the Nintendo Entertainment System or Famicom from Japan. Not the official stuff. That was not going to happen in a while. But clones from Taiwan and China that are becoming quite popular, like Dandy. Entire TV shows around them as well. There's quite a few nice examples in the museum. So when it reopens, if you haven't been there already, go and check it out. Sega, again, not official consoles, but there are, if you can afford them, ways of getting one. But a lot of gaming is also happening on IBM PC Windows computers, which is the most popular platform, at least in my generation, at least for the people that I knew. Because it's really difficult to collect official market data because it wasn't an official market. But you get the idea, right? People are suddenly able to play games without having to smuggle them secretively into the country. It's out there. However, there's a number of challenges that still persist. And the biggest challenge is that there isn't a whole lot of officially available content there. So we don't have any official distribution channels, for one thing. And that is because, again, there was the thing called the Iron Curtain, which means that trade in media content wasn't really something that was going on an official level. And now you have this market which no one has dealt with, no Western company developing, publishing games, no Japanese company has any connections to. They don't know how to talk to them, and I'm not sure if they would consider these markets very viable as well, because people don't earn a lot of money. So who's going to pay, 30, 40 euros, dollars, let's say 70,000 yen for a video game? Especially considering that people don't really speak English, not too much. So you need to localize the content, which is a huge investment as well. Who's going to do that? Well, perhaps not the big names, because for them that is quite a big of a risk. And again, the costs are quite prohibitive for local salaries. It's pricey getting licensed games. And then the local industry, you would hope, okay, what about the local companies? What about the companies in Russia and Belarus and Ukraine producing their own games and selling them? Well, that is a thing, except some of these games are not very good. And the industry at large is just hobbyists that are trying to make money the best, as best they can, as pretty much everyone else was doing inside and outside of the video game market at the time. not a whole lot of quality content to look at. So how do you solve the problem? Well, obviously, you turn to piracy. So the reason this particular context was so conducive to game piracy is the existence copyright legislation at the time was fairly vague, unlike the Western nations, for example, and it was not very well enforced. The practice of stealing stuff, intellectual property, was quite so widespread as to reach, popular singers would just take Western singers' songs, translate the lyrics, and redo covers of them as if that's original material. Nobody minded that. You might as well, try to make some profit out of the situation. Why not sell games? And again, because capitalism was suddenly a thing after the transition from, a state-controlled market, everybody is trying to earn money. There's a lot of entrepreneurship going on, and digital technology just has this niche that hasn't been addressed before, so a lot of people are trying to tap into that. And I'm going to have another look at the chat just to see what people are saying. People are saying hi. Okay, nice to see you. I'm not seeing you, obviously, but nice to know you're there. Righty. Then the other thing is, what does the market look like? Well, again, it's difficult to tell because there's no official archival data, but obviously Russia, with the population and the size of the country, would be the biggest market. Also nicely connected to places like China, which would supply a lot of the technology. And then you have sort of second-order pirates and local distributors in countries like Belarus and Ukraine, which would pirated stuff from Russia and sell it locally without really investing much additional labor, mostly. And what you would do when you wanted to play a game in the 90s, some people may relate to that if you grew up in the same context that I did, you would go to a shop or a kiosk or a market stall, and there would be lots of these places selling music CDs, videos or movies on CDs and DVDs later, games and all that stuff, all over the place, and department stores, shopping centers, markets, just in the street, again, next to a bus stop, a lot of different places. And you'd get a CD for between $2 to $5. And the more the technology became available, the cheaper people were producing them. So when CDRs became a thing, people would just use them instead of regular CDs to cut costs and enter the market. It doesn't sound like much compared to official game prices. It's still quite a steep price to pay if you consider the average salary. I just looked up the data on Belarus, again, because that's where I grew up. And in 1995, the average Belarusian would earn something like $30. So you'd spend a sixth of your monthly income to buy one game CD, which sounds steep. And by the end of the year 2000, you'd earn approximately $100, somewhat better, but again, not a whole lot of an entertainment budget you had there. The fun thing with the whole infrastructure was that a lot of these major retailers that would have shops and kiosks where they would sell CDs actually had a legal status, which sounds counterintuitive to people from the Western nations, because you are essentially making money based on piracy and violating copyright legislation systematically, and still you have a status as a legal entity. You're paying rent, you're paying salaries to your staff, officially you're paying taxes, you're potentially underpaying taxes, but you're still, again, a legal entity, which sounds fun, but that's the way it was. And this is what it would look like. I couldn't get too many pictures because I guess at the time no one deemed these places so important and culturally relevant as to make extensive photo archives of what they would look like. But you can see a sort of a standalone kiosk and a smaller shop and just a cardboard, or is it wood, like a makeshift box that people just constructed for the purpose of selling DVDs in the street. So a lot of that stuff was happening. How did that content even enter the market to begin with? Where did they get access if there was no distribution channel? they could rely on. Well, the interesting thing was they would use the internet, which wasn't that big of a thing. Again, I'm not sure about the mid-90s. There's very few accounts of how that was being done. But towards the turn of the 20th century, you would have connections, apparently, with people in some governmental offices that would have a really stable, really good internet connection. And they would download things for you released by various groups on their internet relay chat servers. Some of you might remember IRC used to be a popular technology that has now been largely superseded by messengers and the likes. So you'd go there, and a lot of these hobbyist groups, again, in places like the US and the UK, would just hack copyright protections in games for the fun of it, upload the thing online, and then people would download that and see if they could localize the starting menu, the interface, potentially the content as well, make a cover for the game and sell it. So that was quite an interesting trajectory that the games traveled in order to end up in those shops and kiosks and places. The thing with that was as well that there was a lot of cost cutting and a lot of corner cutting going on, right? You didn't really have, again, selling those CDs for what, $2 a box. You didn't have a lot of budget to play with. You didn't have money to actually hire a professional translator. So you would either release the game as it is, or maybe translate just the user interface, or use some sort of crude machine translation, which was much worse, to be honest, than an untranslated game. Playing these pirated games is essentially how I picked up my English, because you had to do it in order to understand anything that was going on. If it was a story-driven game that was machine translated, you would be lucky to understand 50% of the content. You wouldn't have fancy things like actual boxes. I mean, other than the regular plastic cheap box for the CD, you wouldn't have user manuals, feelies, which would be the items included, like physical things included with official game boxes, you know, in the West. So well, all of these were not part of the scene. Oftentimes, you wouldn't see any information about the distributor. So there's no logo, there's no contact information, because people wanted to stay sort of in the shadows, anonymous, because who knows when the situation changes and copyright starts being enforced. There was a lot of sort of second level hacking after the hacking, the copy protection has been bypassed by various groups in the West. The local pirates would do their magic and try to squeeze as much content on one CD by repacking the videos or removing them altogether or removing the voice acting, because that was sort of the logic. If you can, you know, nobody's willing to pay for 2 CDs if a competitor is selling the same game on one, even if it's not really the same game because the videos have been recompressed or are entirely missing. And compiling multiple games in one CD was also quite a prominent practice. There didn't really have to be any thematic connection going on either. The result of that corner cutting was that a lot of these games were not really functional, because nobody bothered to check, right? You just put it out and see if it sells. So there was a sort of a vernacular policy, which means that people just decided on some level, it wasn't dictated by the law necessarily, because the law was very vague around those things, that if you couldn't install the game on the seller's computer, so if you came back after purchasing a CD with a game and said, look, it doesn't work for me, and then the seller couldn't install the game on their own device in their own shop, they would go, okay, it seems that the game is unfunctional, here's your money back. So there was a money back policy, which was, again, a sort of ethic formed around the whole thing. With the multiple game compilations, there was a policy, I think in Minsk at least, it was if 30% of the games on the CD were unplayable, you'd get your money back. I don't know how they bothered to verify that, if sometimes you had hundreds of games on one CD, but that was the deal. And you just accepted that, again, because there was no real competition, because licensed games, official releases did not become a thing for a while. And when they did, they were not really competitive price-wise. So you just roll with it. Everybody thought that's how it worked, and that wasn't really something people complained too much about. I'm just going to check the chat before I move on. Nostalgic, yeah, good to know. So we're on the same page here. So to show you some examples, right, of how the scene used to work back at the time, here's one of the many different compilations of the 200 best games of all genres, right? We can see that there were at least 7 installments in the series, so altogether almost 1,500 games that they squeezed on 7 CDs. It wasn't the only one. There were other people doing that as well, and you can see on the back there's a list of the games that were included in the package. I don't actually know what the different colors mean, but you would get the sort of thing which would come with a cheaply made launcher as well, which would just allow you to select the games you wanted to install. And sometimes they would actually work. Other times, not so much. This one, Still Life, I don't know if anyone has played that one. It's a point-and-click adventure game from the early 2000s, which was originally released on a DVD. And you probably know that a DVD contains as much information as, 6, 7 CDs, thereabouts. So someone squeezed all of that content, or actually not all of it, but they tried their best, on one CD, because people were reluctant to pay for DVDs, and there was always a chance of people who were being cheap or couldn't afford anything else buying the thing on one CD, which means that, again, a lot of the actual cutscenes and videos were cut out of the game. I actually played that particular release, and you couldn't make sense of the storyline because a lot of the storyline was just not there. But again, that's how the market functioned. Even if you don't speak Russian, you can see there's something wrong with the screenshot from Diablo in the bottom right corner. Namely that the text doesn't even fit the text box, which is not a good sign. That was not the only problem, however, because the words themselves, the text doesn't make sense. Again, it's an example of machine translation. And if you could make any sort of sense of what was going on in the game by reading these translations, if I dare call them that, well, I mean, that took a certain skill that I, for one, didn't have. Again, let me check what people are saying in the chat. Yeah, the translation leaves much to be desired. I wonder if the people bothered to actually read through their stuff themselves, but I guess not, because you were in a development cycle. You wanted to push as many games out into the market as you could. It was a competitive market after all. A lot of people were trying to earn money in whatever ways they could, right? And it's not specific to games. The whole narrative of opportunistic pirating and people selling stuff without official permissions from the publishers back in the West, where a lot of these games came from. The whole story dates back to the 80s, to the perestroika years, where the market did not really exist on a fully official level, but people would smuggle a lot of content into the country unofficially, and there was, well, people were starting to sell stuff and experiment with being entrepreneurs. So a lot of movies you could actually watch already back in the 80s from the West, mostly Hollywood stuff. The translation quality, again, like with the games, was dubious, but you had to translate them because people didn't speak English. You'd often have one voice actor performing all the roles in the movie. They would usually alter the voice a little bit so that they couldn't be recognized, so they would sound something completely different from what they normally sounded in life. And the same person who did the voiceover would often be the translator, the director, the whatever else responsibility was needed. And it wasn't a particularly strange thing for one VHS tape to contain 2 movies as well, which wasn't how the market worked in the rest of the world. And a lot of these people remained anonymous for a while, although some of their identities have been later uncovered and we know who they are. And some of them are actually successful business people now. But yeah, so that was part of the scene. There was also the cassette tape with music. That was a whole separate market as well. a cassette tape was the easiest thing to produce. You just needed a tape recorder. So they were all over the place. You'd get stuff sold with handwritten, photocopied covers, just that, compilations of different types of music. That didn't last too long because at some point it was just superseded by audio CDs and MP3 collections, which allowed you, especially with the MP3 format becoming pervasive, you could squeeze a lot of content onto the same medium. Again, the same logic as we can see with pirated games. Right. So we can see that the logic of informality that we hear a lot in academic discourses and discussions of piracy is not really something that fully applies here. These people are operating as legal entities, a lot of them, or semi-legal as well, at least. They're the people distributing the stuff have to have a physical presence that is being rented, paying taxes. The translators, those types of folks are less visible, but it's public. It's not being hidden. It's not really something that you had to get into or be introduced through some sort of esoteric circle. It was all over the place. It was in the streets and everybody just accepted it as it was. At the same time, the people actually working on the content, so the translators, the people that did the cover art, the people that recorded the CDs, those preferred to remain anonymous for obvious reasons, I guess. They didn't really want to disclose their full names. Some were eventually doxed, I guess, so we know who some of these people are. Some sort of came out voluntarily, but a lot of these people were never going to find out who they were. There was a dark side to it as well. There's been some nice stuff written about how you had to operate on a certain level of interaction with the official administration. So there were bribes going on. I already alluded to the fact that you had to have a connection sometimes in, say, governmental offices and organizations so you could get your hands on a fast-speed internet connection. Criminality, again, racketeering, that type of thing, that was quite pervasive. I'm not sure to what extent that was a big deal in Belarus, where we'd normally have like small-time racketeers walking around the markets, you know, and basically offering protection for money. But it seems from what I've heard that things were quite dramatic, quite dramatic in places like Moscow, where there would be violence and stuff because criminal groups would compete over influence. So it's not just a nice, fun story to be telling. There were sort of there was a darker underbelly to it as well. This has been described in some academic papers to some extent as a parallel public sphere, right? So you had the official media, you had the television and the radio, which was still a thing, and newspapers and whatnot, but you also had that, you know, the market with MP3s and digital games that was sort of less controlled, but had its own logic, had its own policies like refunds and things. And it was interesting because it allowed people to work around both state censorship, which was and has been quite a thing in the history of East Slavic nations, both in the Soviet days and to some extent in the present day, but also the fact that, you know, people couldn't really afford at the time to purchase licensed content, and it was not really available anyhow. So you had this sphere to go to, which provided the same, well, roughly the same content to them. But again, you had this general logic of, it was very sort of almost homemade, right? People would work with cheap equipment, tight budgets, time constraint. You didn't expect the thing to be brilliant in quality, and you realized that you weren't paying for brilliant quality either. So the value would be not so much in the fancy box design or stuff like that. It would be the quantity of the content you could squeeze, right? Again, the same goes for VHS tapes, cassette tapes, video game CDs. And a lot of that background, my argument is, has left a lasting effect on the media industry itself and the way people still consume content and the memories, the nostalgic memories of game history that the people from that cultural background share and that are not really often addressed in official game historiographies. So I'm going to share two cases with you that I think are quite nice examples of how ambiguous and sometimes twisted and strange the piracy industry was at the time. And the first example that I'd like to share is of a company called Akella, inspired by the wolf in the Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. So popular character. They misspelled the name. I think it was double K single L, but nobody cared. So it was one of the earliest pirate game localizers in Russia to have a name, right? People would sell different types of content, but these were the guys who would actually put a logo on them and seem to display some sort of pride and identity in what they did. They were founded in, according to the official history, there's actually a website that they had in 1993. So the logo obviously has the wolf. I wonder how much time they spent on designing it, but that's a separate story. In just 4 years of being in business, they arrived at the conclusion that there was going eventually to be a shift towards official licensed content. So they wanted to sort of phase out piracy and start doing official translations. Their idea was the future is with official distribution. At some point, the authorities are going to clamp down on pirates. We don't want to be the guys that go to prison for that. So it's interesting because with these sort of humble beginnings that they had, they eventually ended up working with some major Western publishers. They localized games from the likes of Ubisoft and Electronic Arts and Sony for the PlayStation. And they would release titles like The Prince of Persia, translate, release the whole deal to EverQuest. So fairly big name games that they would work with. And it's mind-boggling if you think about it to think that a company that, again, was doing video game piracy would, in just a few years, be the official distributor for the likes of Ubisoft. But it's not that surprising if you think about it, because by the time, again, big name companies in the West would recognize that there is a fairly big market emerging, right? There's a huge demand for video games in the likes of Russia and Ukraine, with millions and millions of people. And Russian is actually a language spoken quite widely across the post-Soviet space, which means you can also sell the same content in places like Kazakhstan and the Baltics because of the large Russian-speaking population. So there was potential there, but there's no one to turn to, really. Who do you go to? You have no connections. Well, you work with the ex-pirates because at least they know how to sell stuff. They have that experience. So it's not really that surprising in practical terms, right? The same thing happened with the company that used to sell and distribute Dendy consoles, which were not a real thing that existed in the West of Japan, which was just a cheap clone of the Nintendo Entertainment System, ended up being the same company that officially represented Nintendo in Russia for quite a while. So that kind of logic was there. But they didn't really become too well liked among the general gamer population. And that was because there was something in their DNA, seemingly, that prevented them from being, from fully conforming to the ideas of, a well-reputed publisher. So one thing they are notorious for is, even as they were an official publisher for many game companies, they started selling a CD version of a game you could freely download from the web. The game was called Volvo the Game. It was a badly designed advert game, so a piece of promotion for Volvo, the car company. You could get it online. It didn't actually take up a whole CD. It was like 100 megabytes or something. But Akella figured, wait, there are people out there who don't have very good internet connections. We are going to sell the game to them, and we're going to charge them for it. And they charged quite a bit because they presented it like an official licensed release and whatnot. But again, it was a free game. So people were quite annoyed at that. That was not the only example, but I'll go back to some of the other ones. So in the year 2000, they also had an in-game, in-house game studio that worked on various games. So they didn't just localize and translate games, they made their own. That was also part of their ambition. And in 2000, they released a game called Korsari, or Sea Dogs, which was a big deal. And it was a big deal not just in the Russian-speaking space. It was fairly popular across the globe. It was popular enough to be translated into English. And I've met people at academic conferences, people from Norway and the Czech Republic, telling me that they've played the game and they have fond memories of it, which means that the English translation was still good for something. It was the first Russian-developed game to be released for the Xbox console, which already goes to show that it was quite an influential thing. And it was a franchise that grew out of the original release. Later, 3 years later, they developed a game called Pirates of the Caribbean, which was released in the West and distributed in the West by Bethesda Softworks, known for the Morrowind and Elder Scrolls series, among other things. It actually had an intro that featured voice acting by Keira Knightley, even though the game itself didn't have much to do with the movie franchise. It was supposed to be another release in the Sea Dogs series, and then they realized they had a chance to capitalize on the popularity of the movies, so they changed a few things very cosmetically, and they distributed the thing, right? Again, a sort of a dubious ethic you can see there. But you can see also they're playing with the big guys, right? They're now entering the sandbox where the big names are hanging out. At the same time, it wasn't all big name, big budgets stuff going on. They also worked with under other brands, and they had sort of lower quality games. They had a I don't know if that was a separate team within Akella or those were the same folks, doing things in their free time. But they had this division called Trash Masters, and that really tells you all you need to know about what they did. They made cheap, dumb, weird games that nobody seemed to like, but you could still sell a certain amount of those because those were original releases and people were curious. I don't know why anyone would buy that. They also did pornographic stuff under the alias Macho Studio, very innovative. So lots of stuff going on, quite busy guys they were. Eventually, despite all these different business interests they were pursuing within gaming, the company went bankrupt. The irony of what happened was when asked for what happened there, what was the reason behind the bankruptcy, they cited the global crisis, the financial crisis, but they also cited piracy. So they complained about people pirating their releases, which was funny for a company who started their life as a pirating studio. So there was that. And let me check what people are writing in the chat and if I'm overlooking some important information. Yeah. Oh yeah, someone mentioned earlier that sometimes you would have people who actually change the storyline in the localization. That's a whole different conversation. There's one notable figure quite notorious for that called Goblin. I don't remember his real name. Puchkov, I think his surname was. So yeah, people were very creative with the unofficial translations, as among other things. Righty. So just to give you a sense, right, of the range of things that Akella did. Here's the Pirates of the Caribbean game, again, released and distributed by Bethesda Softworks. And next to which you're seeing the free game being sold on the markets. You're seeing some erotic games, and you're also seeing Postal 3. Some of you might remember Postal 2 and Postal 1. Controversial American games, hyper-violent, from Running with Scissors, I think the name of the studio was. The studio that released the first two games had no intention of continuing the franchise, but Akella saw it as a business opportunity. They licensed the franchise. They made their own version of the game. It was bad in every conceivable way. It was crashing all the time. People were complaining about the gameplay. The original owners of the franchise, Running with Scissors, actually denounced the thing and didn't want to have anything to do with it, despite giving prior authorization for Akella to work on it. So yeah, interesting things to reconcile if you think about their legacy and the history of games. And I'm going to cite another example that I think is quite interesting, and that one is perhaps even more famous for people who remember those days. It's a company called Fargus Multimedia, which was, again, a Russian company founded in '96 by, the official story is by former Akella employees who wanted to pursue their own sort of path. there is a sort of a conspiracy theory, although there might be some value to it. It was actually the same people, or largely the same people, who worked for the main studio. They just had a different alias to mask, to conceal the fact that it was still the same company doing game piracy. So where the main Akella branch wanted to distance themselves from piracy, they also saw it as a nice business opportunity for the foreseeable future. So I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what some people will tell you. They weren't a game studio, they were a localizer. So their thing was translating games and then distributing pirated games. They obviously didn't request any permissions from the original publishers. How they were different from the other players in the market was that they tried to build a reputation around better quality translations. So they wouldn't do the stuff I've been talking about, like crude machine translations, or not too often anyways. They would try to provide better quality translations with people who graduated from foreign language programs. The actual record remains mixed, but that was the brand, that was the idea, right? They also were unique in that, or at least notable, in that they hired professional voice actors and sometimes actual movie stars to voice some of their titles. So you'd hear the same voices you'd hear on the TV while playing these games, which gave you a total lack of appreciation for the fact that there was actually pirated content. So they wouldn't pay the original publisher, but they would have proper business deals with the translators, the voice actors, the sound directors, and that type of stuff in Russia. And they also took some responsibility for the content they created. They would actually release patches for their translations. So when there would be some sort of bug that people would come across, there would be an official website they could go to, and they could possibly download a fix for the problem. They offered technical support. So it was in many ways like, an official business, except the basic premise of it was that they were pirates. They registered the trademark at some point, as you can see. So you can see again how even the logo evolved over time to look sort of more presentable, more formal, I guess, and less clearly something that alludes to piracy, right, which was their main activity. I'm showing you two game covers, again, from notable games that they translated. And you can see there's a number of recurrent things you see on the covers. One is there's a bit that says voiced by professional actors. So that was a thing they advertised quite heavily. And then there's the thing under the logo, which would go only full length and high quality translation. So it's not the crap you'd get from other pirate localizers. There's actually, if you go beyond the start screen, you'll still have some sort of translation that sounds vaguely like the Russian language, or potentially quite a bit like the Russian language. So that was their selling point, and that was the brand, right? The problem with Fargus was that they did succeed to some extent in establishing a reputation in the market, but then there were second-order pirates, the same people I mentioned before, in places like Russia, but also Ukraine and Belarus, who would copy the pirated stuff, and or either just sometimes it would boil down to placing the Fargus logo on games that weren't actually translated by Fargus, sometimes not translated at all. So the logo, because it was such a selling point, became pervasive, and a lot of distancing was required on the Fargus's part to help people understand that this isn't us, it's just pirates. But obviously that's problematic for your brand image in the long run. They, at some point, did try to transition into legal localization because, again, they had the expertise, they had the context with professional translators, but the damage had been done by that point, right? The reputation with the consumers that they had was suffering quite a bit because of the low-quality translations being released under their brand, despite not being released by Fargus in actuality. The most curious thing in the whole history of game piracy in the region for me is that in 2004, Fargus actually launched a legal case. They tried to sue the pirate companies for using their logo and damaging their business reputation. So their idea was, we're not talking about where the games are coming from, but we have a registered trademark, which is Fargus, and people are putting our trademark on their box sets, and that is not a good thing. They should not do that. And they went to court with that premise. You can imagine how the idea was controversial, and there was a lot of different opinions were being voiced about the problem. The official lawyer representing Fargus made the following claim: even if the trademark is associated on the market with pirated products, it does not mean it cannot be used legally. So the argument was, okay, we've done piracy in the past, but we want to transition to official localizations, and people are stealing our brand. Let's not allow them to do that. On the other hand, the official reaction from government agencies such as the Information Market Safety Agency and then in Russia was that, well, it's a very dubious claim because the trademark is in fact only exclusively associated with pirated content, so there's a lot of questions to be answered there. The fan response was, again, mostly protective and supportive of Fargus, partly because of the nostalgia and the trust developed over time with the brand, partly because people inherently didn't really see piracy as that much of a problem. So that was a mentality that was still in the process of change, I suppose. But yeah, long story short, Fargus lost the case. Eventually, they went out of business. We don't really know what happened with the founders of the company because we've never established who they are. But it left a certain legacy, and it's a kind of legacy that you do see in the official game scene in the nations of Eastern Europe today. So a lot of the translators who worked with Fargus, they did sort of graduate to careers in official game localization. A lot of them still work in the industry as professional localizers with official releases. There's also the fact that some of the important historical titles, you just call them classics, games like Neverhood or Blade Runner or Planescape, are only actually available in Russian as Fargus translations. Someone pointed it out to me, and I was really surprised when I went to GOG.com, so goodoldgames.com, which is a website that is sort of this team of retro games, right? It specializes on indie and older games being re-released and adapted for modern devices. You can actually see that some of the Fargus translations are being sold there officially, right, alongside the official English language release. So you can see that somehow retroactively, these pirated translations weave themselves back into the official game history, and you can still purchase them. Some of the people who worked with Fargus broke off to found a separate game studio called Seventh Wolf. They worked for a few more years in the pirated market, but I don't know what happened to them. The interesting thing is also there was a vibrant community of Fargus patrons online that were quite active on the forums, and they continued to stay in touch for quite a few years after Fargus released their last game, which was 2007-ish, I think. They would organize meetups in person, including just a few years back. So that kind of legacy has carried on. You can also see some fan-created archives of the cover images, and there's fan databases of their releases as well. So people are trying to preserve that past because they have an understanding of no official historian of games, or most likely, would bother to preserve that legacy. So you can see how there has been quite a bit of an influence and a confluence between pirated game localization and the official video game market in the East Slavic nations. But the landscape has changed over the years. CD and DVD piracy has gradually declined, partly because of the advent of broadband internet and digital distribution. Now we have platforms like Steam. Why bother going to a physical store and buying a DVD there? For a time, there was a history of internet providers in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia offering sort of local networks with lots of unofficial pirated content for the users as an incentive for people to join. and sign up for their internet services. So the piracy just moved into the online realm. The enforcement of copyright also became tougher than it used to be, and there have been cases discussed in the media of criminal proceedings against pirate CD sellers. So that's something that became more prominent, and then people obviously are going to be more cautious about engaging in piracy. Although, again, it doesn't mean that piracy doesn't exist. There's lots of game download portals. There's torrent trackers that pirate games and advertise stuff to the people that download them and support themselves thusly that exist to the day. Maybe I should have the links here because, anyway, you can see them now, and I didn't consider that maybe it's not a good idea to advertise them here. Righty. So some examples from the media of, again, the police confiscating pirate DVDs en masse in the city of Tver in Russia, or counterfeit DVDs in a very symbolic kind of gesture being crushed by a bulldozer. So you can see how the attitudes have changed over the years. Not a very favorable environment for being a pirate anymore, right? However, the thing that makes these two stories quite meaningful to me and also quite important is that they tell us something about the broader landscape of gaming and the history of gaming in that region. You can see how they were far from the only companies, but Akella and Fargus both exemplified the market by being in this legally ambiguous position of sort of operating on a legal basis, you know, being registered entities with physical properties being rented, who concluded contracts with voice actors and translators, and were in business without needing to hide necessarily, but who also systematically violated the copyright law as a part of their business model. And now that both companies are gone, the legacy that they left behind is contentious. It's difficult to say, did they do more harm or or were they beneficial to the markets? But they certainly left a trace in the official game industry. So we can say for a fact that Fargus did supply a lot of qualified human resources to the official localization market. So when that became a thing where official localizations were actually necessary, where did you turn to for people who knew how to translate games? Well, obviously nobody else knew other than people who had been translated games for a few years then, and those were the people Fargus worked with. Akella transitions into first a licensed localization company and then a game studio, and it helped quite a bit to connect the Russian game industry with its Western counterparts. So again, establishing the ties between the likes of Ubisoft and Bethesda, that was quite a big deal. And so when you think back to the question, right, that I posed in the beginning of this talk, is piracy really truly something that we just think about as an informal part of the media landscape? I guess not. It's at the very least semi-formal in this case, and you can also see similar examples from other Eastern European countries. Again, Camille and Andrei would be able to tell you more about Estonia, for example, I guess. Also places like China, Latin America, a lot of interesting stuff going on there. So it's not a unique thing, but it's something that's been largely missing from the conversation when we talk about game history. And that is why I wanted to address it today. And I think that's all I have for today. So thank you very much for joining the talk. And I think I can finish showing you the slides and we can have a little bit of discussion if people feel like sharing their memories or asking things. So thank you very much.
Having a side, yes, is there a side market of these pirate games today?
It's interesting that, yeah, you can, I think actually Andres will be able to answer the question better, but there's certainly a lot of nostalgia, not just for the games, but for the landscape as it was with the pirates and everything. That's one of the reasons why you have fan communities preserving the cover art. That's one of the reasons why people still have meetups and stuff. Because it was all CD based and because it was largely in the era of the internet, or at least the concept was familiar to people, a lot of the actual pirated stuff itself is no longer, like, I don't know personally of any people who would go out of their way to buy used pirated CD because a lot of these games are digitized and you can download, it's through a torrent tracker or something like that. But the translations themselves are quite well remembered. Some games have become sort of cult classics, specifically, say, in the Fargus translation. I'm thinking Worms, the party game. It's supposed to be better than the original, the way they localized it. And then people are still distributing and sharing it, again, using sometimes official channels as well. But also there was a lot of, I don't know how I skipped that slide. Maybe I pressed something wrong. I had a slide where I just briefly showed how the thing was covered in the mass media at the time, and you had magazines and newspapers. There were things like Virtualny Radosti in Belarus. There was Speed, I think, in Ukraine. There was a popular TV show called Advinta in Russia, where they would review games without really alluding to the fact that there was pirated stuff, but it was obvious to everyone involved, including the audience, that there was no way to get your hands on official products at the time. And there has been a sort of a comeback. The same people who were the frontmen for the show now have a YouTube show, I believe. So it was forgotten for a long time when, again, official localization became more of a thing. They no longer had a show, on an actual TV channel. And now there's the sort of the cult popularity revival going on with them. So there is a lot of nostalgia. How big it is in terms of a market for like secondhand stuff, I think not so much, because unlike console related stuff, there is less of an idea of sort of authenticity that you need to have an old computer with Windows, 2000 or 98, 8 to 9, 98, yeah, to run these sort of things, because you can still run them on a virtual machine or something. So not sure how much, yeah, again, of a proper market it is. But we do know for a fact that there's companies somewhere manufacturing, Sega Mega Drives without the Sega part. So there is a market around it. I just think that the market largely focuses on the console stuff rather than the PC.
There is actually a question from Nikita.
Yeah.
Asking if you can see it in the chat box, like
yeah, is there any estimate about how big the pirate market was? I don't know, not to my knowledge. Again, I'm not a market researcher, to be honest, so I didn't really try to collect data about what the sales were. I don't know how that's going to be possible, because a lot of that is not reflected in any official statistics that you could look into. But the truth of the matter is, for a long time, there was no official market to compete with, right? Or very little by means of like official releases. So the pirate market was pretty much the only thing that the vast majority of people could turn to. So for me, it's safe to say that until the late 90s, at least, the pirate market was pretty much all there was. To what extent, how many CDs they produced. I actually read an interview with one of the anonymous Fargus founders. So he didn't want to disclose his name, but he discussed some of the company history, and he refused to provide any numbers. I don't know if that was because he actually didn't know how many CDs they released, or because it was supposed to be some sort of, secret information that wasn't to be revealed to the public. But yeah, sorry, I don't have any specific numbers. And there's a nice comment from Andrew as well, saying that things like Game & Watch. Sorry, a little issue here. Yes. So what happened was some of the things that were released physically, so like the Game & Watch clones with Nu Pagadi characters and the Dandy consoles are going up in price, because they are a sought-after commodity, and they are more difficult to find seemingly than the, not sure about the original Game & Watch, but the original Nintendo Entertainment System, for example, which was mass-produced in Japan and other parts of the world. What did the older generations think of video games? It's an interesting question, because one of the places, it's again, I can only give you anecdotal accounts. I don't have data to base this on. But for me, what was curious was the first time I played Doom, for example, right? The shooter, the original game, the first one from ID Software. was when I visited my mom's workplace in the mid-90s. And it wasn't on a computer in the accountant's office. You'd see video games again, ranging from Doom to I don't remember what other ones they had. Later they had Quake, so a lot of first-person shooters, weirdly. And in retrospect, it is a bit strange to think that, you know, a 40, 50-year or something accountant at a government-owned company would have that type of game and that kind of time to play it. I don't know if they actually played it, but it was there, all right? So that's curious to me. Some people were judgmental, and I guess that's a generational thing that was always going to be the case, and it was not specific to the Soviet and post-Soviet context. But of course, video games were seen as as a pastime that wasn't exactly, you know, approved of. That was manifestly worse than, you know, playing in the street or studying, or, you know, there was a lot of judgment in that regard. But you could also see that a lot of the game content was actually found in offices, you know, where middle-aged people would still have them and play them. In addition, it wasn't just school kids like myself. Ooh, and that's quite a cool insight from Olga there. So, who knows someone who worked at Akella, and the things got so bad for them that at the end they would just, they couldn't afford to pay back their debts. They would just give out CDs. That's nice. I mean, as a someone who was owned a debt by Akella, I probably wouldn't appreciate that. But from a history perspective, that's quite cool.
So, by the way, if anyone else don't want to react anymore, would like to say thank you a lot. Next week it will be very interesting. Also, we will talk mostly with Anna from Polish side. So yes, it will be interesting to have this contrast from that post-Soviet time in this area, and maybe for some more invitations. You introduced about your this part about flash games, which is actually very interesting, because I actually, I guess when people are opening their Chrome browser, it's written then actually in December, the 1st of January, I think, or
it's either the 31st of December or 1st of January. Yeah.
Yes. So there will Chrome will not support anymore Flash. So it means that Flash players. So it means that a lot of Perls that was programmed with a director or from Flash animations. Of course, I guess there will be still some alternatives to read it, but it means something that how to if there is a need to preserve, what are the conditions to save that legacy. And there is a lot of also artists that worked a lot with this medium, and maybe like in some other talks we would have occasion to talk about it.
Yeah, it would be really nice. Flash is a little bit of a sort of a pet project of mine that I'm quite interested in. For the artists, it's not so bad because it's still around as Adobe Animate. They've just renamed it, and the cartoons that were created with Flash are quite easily convertible into MP4. You can see them on YouTube and stuff. They don't look as nice, but they're still around. Games is a whole different thing because the player's not going to be around. But yeah, it's a whole different story that would be nice to discuss at some point, maybe on a different occasion. For now, I just wanted to say thank you to all the people who joined us. It was lovely to to have you join me with my trip down the memory lane. I mean, for some of you, this might have been an entirely foreign context as well, and I'm glad if you found it interesting. I can only, I guess, further advertise the talk by Anna next week, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because she's a colleague of mine whose work I'm familiar with, and she's done interesting stuff that is more sort of empirical than mine. She's talked with a lot of actual game developers in the Polish industry, some of whom are former pirates, some of whom have struggled very hard with pirates. So she has a whole different perspective on the Polish side of things. So check it out if you have time. I think it's going to be fun.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes. And of course, in our museum, we have pretty big collection of those CDs from first PlayStation. Here we have Kudos translations. And I played, I would say, most of them, and almost all of them have totally broken translation and cut content. So it's a good, how to say, physical representation. Because people started donating those illegal games to the museum, and we're very happy to collect all of them. And it's great to try them out and see all those things that you told, that information is totally cut, the video is cut, the quality is low, the translation is wrong, nothing is working. Some of the games are just unplayable from the start. So yes, and it's great to study those things.
We have a very good example. Like we have is from Andrei's childhood. He had Super Mario version, like the first Super Mario Bros. From Nintendo NES, made for Sega Mega Drive. So
yes, this kind of hack.
And the hack is so badly
it's unplayable
written that even like the game don't start. So when there is no collision from the beginning, so when the game starts, like the character is just like falling down in the so there is this kind of surprise that kids could find out when they get the games. Actually, it's possible to make it work, but it's funny that you have to find like a proper way to put the cartridge to make the game bug to make it work. Like you have to make the game glitching to make the game working. So it's
and one thing I can add is that some of the materials, like when the cartridge didn't sell, they reused the same cartridge but put inside another game. So we have Dune 2 here, but under the Dune label you can see another label of another game that was before on the same plastic card. So if the game was unpopular, they just reused the materials, and that's quite astonishing.
And also I would like to complete with maybe to conclude that that what we are usually saying at the museum is what we are insisting. It's also that we are not showing piracy as an example of how it was good, how that game was pirated, but actually it's more about to show that without that piracy practices, we wouldn't have the this history of video games, like a common a collective memory about video games. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice evening.
Thank you all.
And play safe.
Yeah, stay safe. Cheers. Thanks for the invitation again. It was fun.
Bye-bye.